Man finds abandoned bear cubs on his farm and is shocked to discover their true identity. The wind howled through the Absaroka Mountains like a living thing, carrying with it the promise of another brutal Montana winter. Caleb Morgan pulled his worn flannel shirt tighter around his shoulders as he stepped onto the porch of his small ranch house, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid morning air. The thermometer nailed to the cedar post read 12-degree F, and the sun had barely crested the jagged peaks that surrounded his isolated valley. "Come on, girl," he called softly to the golden shape that emerged from the house behind him. Sasha, his 9-year-old golden retriever, stretched and yawned before padding down the wooden steps, her thick winter coat already dusted with snowflakes from the overnight storm. Caleb had been living in this solitude for 7 years now. Ever since the accident that had torn his world apart, the ranch had belonged to his wife's uncle, a gruff old rancher who'd left it to them in his will, with the condition that they'd actually use it. Sarah had been so excited about the prospect of raising their children in the mountains, away from the chaos of city life. She'd had such plans: a vegetable garden, maybe some chickens teaching their kids to fish in the creek that wound through the property. But children never came, and Sarah never got to see her second spring in the mountains. The drunk driver, who'd taken his family, had left Caleb with nothing but this ranch, a pension from his years as a park ranger, and Sasha, the puppy Sarah had surprised him with just months before the accident. In those first dark months, when the grief felt like it might actually kill him, Sasha had been the only reason he'd gotten out of bed each morning. Now the routine was simple and solitary. Feed the 3 remaining goats that somehow survived, each winter in their reinforced shelter. Check the propane levels for the generator. Split enough firewood to last another few days. Fix whatever the weather had broken overnight. Repeat until spring, then repeat until winter again. Need to find those gloves, Caleb muttered to himself as he trudged through the knee-deep snow toward the shed. His old leather work gloves had disappeared somewhere in the chaos of yesterday's storm preparations, and his hands were already going numb despite the wool mittens he'd found as a substitute. The shed stood about 50 yards from the main house, its corrugated metal roof heavy with snow. Caleb had built it himself during his second year here, back when he'd still harbored illusions about expanding the ranch operation. Now it served mainly as storage, for tools, hay, and the accumulated detritus of a life lived in isolation. Sasha trotted ahead of him, her tail wagging as she caught some scent on the wind. She'd been acting oddly all morning, whining at the back door and pacing by the window that faced toward the shed. Caleb had attributed it to the storm. Animals often got restless when the weather was about to change. He pulled open the heavy wooden door of the shed and immediately noticed something was wrong. The neat stacks of hay bales he'd arranged the previous fall had been disturbed, and there was a strange smell in the air. Not the usual scent of dried grass and old wood, but something wilder, more primal. What the hell? Caleb stepped deeper into the shed, following Sasha, who had already pushed her way past him and was now whining softly at a pile of loose hay in the far corner. That's when he heard it. A sound so quiet he almost missed it over the wind rattling the roof. A tiny mewing like kittens, but different somehow, lower, more guttural. Caleb knelt beside the hay pile and carefully began to move the damp stalks aside. Sasha pressed close against his shoulder, her whole body trembling with excitement or anxiety. He couldn't tell which. Easy, girl. Let's see what we've got here. The first thing he saw was fur. Thick, dark fur that was definitely not from any domestic animal. As he cleared away more hay, 3 small forms became visible, huddled together so tightly they almost looked like a single creature. Bear cubs. Caleb sat back on his heels, his heart hammering against his ribs. They were tiny, probably no more than a few months old, with the characteristic rounded ears and short snouts of North American black bears. Their eyes were open, but had that reddish tinge that spoke of very recent birth, though their gaze seemed unusually alert for creatures so young. "Jesus," he whispered. One of the cubs lifted its head at the sound of his voice, fixing him with a stare that was equal parts terrified and defiant. The other 2 remained motionless, except for the rapid rise and fall of their breathing. Caleb's mind raced. Where was their mother? Black bears were fiercely protective of their young. There was no way she would have abandoned them voluntarily. He thought about the rifle shots he'd heard echoing through the valley 2 days ago. Hunters weren't supposed to be this far up the mountain, especially not during winter when the bears should have been hibernating, but that had never stopped the more reckless ones. He stood slowly and backed toward the door, motioning for Sasha to follow. "Come on, girl, let's let them be for now." But as they reached the threshold, Caleb noticed the dark stains in the snow outside the shed. He knelt and touched one of the spots with his finger. The snow was tinted pink, with what could only be blood. The trail led away from the shed toward the tree line, growing fainter with each step until it disappeared entirely among the pines. The mother was dead. Caleb was certain of it now. These cubs were orphans, and at their age, without intervention, they would be dead within days. He looked down at Sasha, who was still staring intently at the shed door. "What do you think, girl? Think we can handle 3 more mouths to feed?" Sasha's tail wagged once, and somehow that settled it. The next few hours were a blur of preparation and improvisation. Caleb cleared out a corner of the woodshed, the warmest outbuilding on the property, and lined it with old blankets and sleeping bags. He moved the cubs one at a time, wrapping each tiny form in a towel and trying to ignore the way they growled and snapped at him despite their obvious weakness. The largest of the 3, a male with distinctive white markings on his chest, he decided to call Ash. The second, slightly smaller but with the most aggressive temperament, became Milo. The female, who seemed the most withdrawn and spent most of her time pressed against the far wall of their makeshift den, he named Fern, after the delicate patterns of white fur around her ears. Feeding them proved to be the biggest challenge. Caleb tried everything he could think of: warm milk, canned cat food, even some leftover roast beef from his own dinner. The cubs refused it all, huddling together in their corner and making soft distress calls that broke his heart. It was Sasha who provided the breakthrough. On the second night, as Caleb sat in his kitchen, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee and wondering if he was fighting a losing battle, he heard an unusual sound from the direction of the woodshed. Not the cubs' distressed mewing, but something softer, more rhythmic. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way across the yard, Sasha padding silently beside him. When he opened the door to the woodshed, he froze at what he saw. Sasha was lying in the makeshift den, her body curved protectively around the 3 cubs. They were no longer huddled against the wall, but pressed close against her warm golden fur, and little Fern was actually nursing, her tiny paws kneading against Sasha's belly. "Well, I'll be damned," Caleb whispered. Sasha looked up at him with an expression that seemed almost sheepish, as if she'd been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to. But her tail was wagging, and for the first time since he had found the cubs, they looked truly peaceful. Over the following weeks, the unlikely family began to settle into a routine. Sasha spent most of her time with the cubs, leaving only for short trips outside to relieve herself or to eat the food Caleb provided. The cubs, in turn, seemed to accept her as their surrogate mother, following her lead in everything from sleep, schedules to grooming habits. Caleb found himself spending hours in the woodshed, simply watching them interact. Sasha would gently discipline the cubs when they got too rough with each other, using the same soft growl she'd once used on puppies from a neighbor's litter years ago. The cubs learned to recognize her authority, though they remained deeply suspicious of Caleb himself. "Can't say I blame you," he told them one afternoon as he left their daily offering of raw meat. He'd started driving to town twice a week for fresh supplies from the butcher. Strange human shows up and disrupts your whole world. I'd be suspicious too. The cubs had grown noticeably in the months since he'd found them. Ash, the largest, was already showing signs of the powerful build he'd develop as an adult. Milo remained the most aggressive, often positioning himself between Caleb and the other 2 whenever the human entered their space. Fern was still the most timid, but she'd begun to watch Caleb with what seemed like curiosity rather than pure fear. It was during a particularly brutal February blizzard that Caleb realized how much the cubs had come to mean to him. The storm had knocked out power to the main house, and he'd been forced to take shelter in the woodshed with his improvised family. As the wind howled outside and snow piled against the door, he found himself talking to them, really talking, the way he hadn't talked to another living being since Sarah's death. "You know, I never thought I'd have kids," he told them as Sasha settled herself between him and the cubs, serving as a living buffer. "Sarah and I tried for years, but it just wasn't in the cards. She used to say, maybe we were meant to help other kinds of children. You know, foster kids, maybe." He trailed off, watching as Ash and Milo wrestled playfully in their corner, while Fern observed from what she clearly considered a safe distance. Guess she was right in a way. The blizzard lasted 3 days, and by the time it ended, something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between Caleb and the cubs. They still wouldn't allow him to touch them, and they definitely didn't seek out his attention the way they did Sasha's, but the fear had diminished. They would eat while he was in the room now, and occasionally he would catch one of them, usually Fern, watching him with what looked almost like interest. When spring finally began to show itself in the lengthening days, in the gradual retreat of the snow, the cubs started to explore beyond the confines of the woodshed. At first, they ventured only as far as the main yard, always staying close to Sasha and retreating to their den at the first sign of anything unfamiliar. But as the weeks passed and their confidence grew, their expeditions became more ambitious. Caleb would find evidence of their activities scattered around the property, small holes dug in the soft earth near the house, claw marks on the bark of the apple trees Sarah had planted, and increasingly small gifts left near the back door. The first was a field mouse, deposited neatly on the welcome mat. Then a small bird, its neck cleanly broken. Caleb wasn't sure if these offerings were meant as presents or some kind of territorial marking, but he accepted them with the same grace he would have shown a house cat bringing him a trophy. "Thank you," he would say solemnly each time he discovered a new addition to the collection, and he swore he could see satisfaction in the cubs' eyes when they watched him from a distance. By late April, the cubs were spending most of their days outside, returning to the woodshed only for sleep and during. The winter had been particularly harsh, but the cubs had grown substantially. Ash now came up to Caleb's knee when he stood on his hind legs, and all three had developed the confident, rolling gait that would serve them well in the wild. Around that time, one of Caleb's goats fell ill with what looked like a respiratory infection. He'd treated similar cases before, but this seemed more serious. He didn't want to risk losing the animal by relying on his own amateur veterinary skills. Dr. Harris Monroe had been the local large animal vet for almost 20 years. Caleb had called on him several times since moving to the ranch. Harris was a practical man, with a dry sense of humor and an unflappable demeanor that served him well with both sick animals and their worried owners. "Pneumonia," Harris announced after examining the goat. "Caught it early, though. Few days of antibiotics, and she should be fine." As they walked back to Harris's truck, Caleb kept glancing nervously toward the woodshed. The cubs had been out exploring when the vet arrived, but they had a habit of showing up at unpredictable times. The last thing Caleb needed was to explain 3 juvenile black bears to someone legally required to report them. "You seem jumpy today," Harris observed, loading his equipment bag into the pickup. "Everything all right?" "Just tired," Caleb lied. "Long winter, you know." Harris nodded sympathetically, but his eyes suggested he wasn't fully convinced. "Well, if you need anything else, just give me a call. And Caleb, if you've got something unusual going on out here, something you're not sure how to handle. I've been doing this job long enough to know the best solution isn't always the most obvious one." Before Caleb could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the woodshed. Sasha came tearing around the corner, tail tucked, ears flattened against her head. Something Caleb had never seen before. Behind her, moving with fluid grace that belied their youth, came Ash, Milo, and Fern. They halted when they saw the 2 men. For a long moment the scene held. 3 increasingly large bear cubs stared at the stranger, while Sasha positioned herself protectively between them and the perceived threat. Then, as if responding to an invisible cue, the cubs melted back into the forest with a silence that was almost supernatural. Harris stood motionless, eyes fixed on the spot where they had disappeared. When he finally turned to Caleb, his expression was unreadable. "Well," he said quietly, "that's something you don't see every day." The silence between them stretched like a taut wire. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled for an explanation that wouldn't sound insane. But Harris was already walking toward the woodshed, his professional curiosity overtaking any concern. "How long?" he asked, examining the makeshift den, the remnants of raw meat, and unmistakable signs of long-term habitation. "Since December," Caleb admitted. There was no point in lying now. "Found them after that big storm. Mother was dead, probably trapped by hunters." Harris knelt and picked up one of the sleeping bags, still holding the musky scent of the cubs. "North American black bears," he said, not as a question. "You've been raising them yourself." "Sasha did most of the work," Caleb replied, watching as his dog stared toward the forest where the cubs had vanished. "I just provided food and shelter." Harris stood and turned toward him. Caleb braced for the inevitable lecture. What he'd done was illegal in a dozen ways: keeping protected wildlife, failing to report it, creating a potentially dangerous situation. But Harris began to laugh. "Do you have any idea," he said between chuckles, "how many people have tried to hand-raise bear cubs over the years? You know what the success rate is?" Caleb shook his head. "Close to zero. Cubs, that young without their mother, they usually die within days, even with professional care. The ones that survive often become so habituated to humans, they can never be released. They live in captivity, if they're lucky, or they're put down for being too dangerous." "These aren't like that," Caleb said quickly. "They don't seek out humans. They barely tolerate me, even after all this time." "I can see that," Harris replied. "They bolted the moment they saw me. That's a good sign." He paused, studying Caleb. "What's your plan? You can't keep them forever." The question hit like a blow. Caleb had been dreading it. The cubs were already too large to safely coexist with people. Within a year, they'd be fully grown predators, potentially dangerous if threatened. "I don't know," he admitted. Harris was silent, gaze shifting between the forest and the shed where the cubs had learned to be bears under the guidance of a golden retriever. "There's a wildlife rehabilitation group about 2 hours south, Yellowstone Bear Rescue. They specialize in cases like this, orphaned cubs that need prepping for release. I know the director, Dr. Sarah Chen. She's done miracles with animals everyone else had given up on." Caleb felt a twist in his chest at the name Sarah, but pushed the feeling aside. What would that involve? "A gradual transition," Harris said. "They'd help reduce the cubs' dependence on you and Sasha while teaching them survival skills. It's not quick, could take 6 months or more. But if anyone can give them a shot at real freedom, it's her team." The thought of losing the cubs felt like yet another death in a life already marked by loss. But Caleb knew Harris was right. The alternative, letting them become dangerous or caged, was unthinkable. "I'll make the call," he said. The following weeks were a blur of planning and preparation. Dr. Chen proved to be everything Harris had promised: a soft-spoken woman with encyclopedic knowledge of bear behavior and a gentle presence that calmed both Caleb and the cubs. "They're remarkable," she told him after watching from a distance for several hours. "I've never seen such perfect wild behavior in animals cared for by humans. Your dog did an incredible job as their surrogate mother." The rehabilitation plan was structured to reduce stress while slowly preparing the cubs for independence. It began with building a temporary enclosure deep in the forest on Caleb's land, far from the house to discourage human association, but close enough to monitor. Caleb threw himself into the work with a focus that even surprised him. He spent days cutting timber and hauling supplies through the woods, building a shelter that would give the cubs a sense of security while they adapted to their new environment. Sasha supervised the construction, occasionally disappearing for 3 hours to check on the cubs in their hiding spots throughout the forest. The move was set for a warm day in late May, when the cubs would be active and more open to change. Dr. Chen and 2 of her assistants arrived early with specialized gear to transport the bears safely. But when they went to the woodshed, it was empty. "They know," Sasha seemed to say with her eyes as she led the group into the forest toward a thick patch of brush about half a mile from the house. "They always know." The cubs were waiting, in a small clearing near the creek, alert and restless, pacing in circles and making quiet vocalizations Caleb had never heard before. When the humans approached, they didn't run. They simply watched with eyes that held a depth of awareness, almost as if they were questioning the moment. "It's time," Caleb said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. The transfer went more smoothly than expected. The cubs followed Sasha's lead with minimal resistance, guided into their new enclosure, a carefully constructed space designed to be a bridge between captivity and freedom. By evening, they were exploring, sniffing corners and testing logs, as if beginning to understand what this new place would mean. The hardest part was leaving. Caleb stood at the enclosure's edge as the last light faded, watching the young bears roam. Sasha leaned against his leg, her body tense, her gaze fixed on the mesh wall that now stood between her and the cubs she'd helped raise. "I know, girl," Caleb whispered, running his hand through her fur. "I know." The next 6 months passed both too quickly and too slowly, filled with visits from Dr. Chen's team and daily monitoring by Caleb. The cubs adjusted fast, hunting, foraging, and displaying behaviors that had lain dormant during their early days among humans. As summer gave way to autumn, the cubs became more independent, and their tolerance for humans faded, a welcome development that suggested their wild instincts were returning. The final assessment came on a crisp October morning. The aspens were ablaze in gold and red, and the air carried that unmistakable edge of oncoming winter. Dr. Chen and her team spent hours documenting the cubs' behaviors, testing their reactions and physical health. "They're ready," she said at last. "As ready as any bears I've worked with. The release will happen tomorrow." That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He stood on the porch past midnight, staring toward the trees where the cubs now slept, unaware of the change coming. Sasha stayed close, her nose nudging his hand from time to time, a silent comfort that stirred memories of other nights, other losses. The release was both anticlimactic and devastating. At dawn, Dr. Chen's team opened the enclosure gate and stepped back to observe. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then Ash appeared first, cautious but determined. Milo followed, and then Fern. They stood at the threshold, testing the air, weighing their options. And then, without fanfare, they walked into the forest. Sasha trailed after them for 50 yards, then stopped. She sat in the middle of the trail, lifted her head, and let out a long, mournful howl that echoed through the trees like a goodbye. Then she turned and came back to Caleb, who stood with tears silently tracking down his cheeks. In the months that followed, the cubs were occasionally seen, distant shadows between trees, paw prints in the snow, but they never came close again. And Caleb began to believe they'd claimed territories deeper within the Absaroka wilderness, where human presence faded to myth. Nearly a year after the release, he saw them again. It was a golden autumn evening. He was on the porch brewing coffee and watching the mountains fade into dusk. Sasha lay at his feet, her muzzle silver with age. Movement on the ridge caught his eye. He reached for the binoculars. There they were, 3 large bears silhouetted against the skyline. Ash, broad and regal, stood slightly ahead. Milo, thick and solid, had the build of a full-grown male. Fern, sleek and graceful, bore the same white markings around her ears that had inspired her name. They didn't come closer, they just stood watching, a quiet presence, deliberate and aware. Caleb rose, hand instinctively reaching for the pendant around his neck, Sarah's necklace which he'd worn ever since finding the cubs. "Thank you," he whispered. As if hearing him, the bears turned and disappeared over the ridge, leaving behind only faint prints in the earth. He stood there until darkness fell, holding the necklace and thinking of another autumn night years ago, when Sarah had spoken of the life they would build in these mountains. She had been right. They had raised a family here. Just not the kind either of them had imagined. At his feet, Sasha stirred and looked up with eyes full of quiet wisdom. Her tail gave a gentle thump, a silent affirmation. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and the coming winter. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb looked toward the changing seasons not with sorrow, but with hope.